Hello, and welcome to another episode of Great Women in Compliance with Hema Lomax and Lisa Fine, hosted by the Compliance Podcast Network and sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insight. I am Hema Lomax, and I am very excited to introduce you to our guest today, Vanessa Hans, the head of the private sector division at the Basel Institute on Governance in Switzerland. As head of the private sector at the Basel Institute, Vanessa is dedicated to building a community of professionals who are committed to collective anti-corruption action. Vanessa is also a competitive endurance athlete. We'll be hearing a bit more about that. But Vanessa, welcome. We're so happy to have you join us today.
Thank you so much, Emma, and a real pleasure to be here.
We're going to really excited to dive into to learn about you and your origin story and ask you what brought you to this illustrious career in global anti-corruption compliance. But first, if I may, I would love you to share with our listeners more about your experience as a competitive endurance athlete. What's that all about?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've had a parallel career in cycling, so that
Ah,
took a bit of time out of my, I would say, day job. But I've been racing mountain bikes, triathlons, and also more broadly endurance cycling, which is long distance cycling. So some of you may be familiar with ultra distance cycling. I took part in the Race Across America, so that's a 3,000-mile race across the
wow.
U.S. coast. So yeah, just keeping busy on the weekends, I would say.
My goodness, don't ask me about my weekends. That's a fine way to keep busy, and you've been doing that for a number of years, I hear.
Ever since I was a child. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah. And what got you into cycling then as a child, and what made you think you wanted to go for gold when it comes to endurance cycling?
So my family's always been big into sports. So both of my parents were big into sports, and my dad was starting mountain biking, I would say, in the 90s. And so I started with that. And yeah, it was just a great community. So I think when you grow up, it's just really great to be part of a very inclusive community, and people are really just cheering you on and trying to make the most of it. Also visiting a lot of places. So I was very lucky to be able to travel in different parts of the world because of cycling. And also just gives you a slightly different perspective. So when you're in your day job, it also gives you a slightly different network and other people to connect with a bit beyond your horizons.
Yes, I thought as much. I figured that your hobby, your weekend hobby, was actually going to impact very positively your day job as well. That's incredible. The things you must have seen, 3,000 miles across the US. I think you live in Switzerland, so you've got Europe at your fingertips as well. It must be magnificent scenery and magnificent destinations and journeys.
No, absolutely. And you'd be surprised. I did come across a couple of compliance women who are also great into the cycling in different parts of the world. So it's always a great conversation starter, I would say, and just inspires you to go to visit other places and look at them slightly differently. As a tourist, it's also a little bit different because it just gives you a slightly different perspective and allows you to connect with people and go to places that are often beyond the usual places that people go visit.
Oh, I love that. I'm so inspired. And to your point, lessons for life, not just for cycling. Very important.
For sure.
Okay, so we talked about your origin story for cycling, but what brought you into this illustrious career in anti corruption?
Yeah, so actually, I used to work in the Philippines. So before joining the Basel Institute, I was the managing director of the French Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the Philippines. And so my job was to help companies set up in the country, but also find business partners. And of course, with that comes a whole range of challenges
Mhm.
when it comes to trans business. And I was very much into the weeds of helping companies and helping them navigate through sometimes very complex either regional or local challenges when it comes to ease of doing business and access to certain markets. So I think that really prompted me to go to the other side and see what can be done in order to help businesses that are trying to work across countries, different legislations, different jurisdictions. And so that was the starting point, and the Basel Institute was really where I started to look at anti-corruption more specifically from the other side of the fence, if I can say so.
And so it sounds like you took action when you were inspired by what you saw in the Philippines to see if you could have impact at scale.
Yes, absolutely. And so before the chamber, I also used to work in the corporate social responsibility space. I know that now the terminology has evolved, but back then it was also very much about sustainability and the ethical side of doing business. I think now the work that I do in the anti-corruption space really allows me to combine those two elements, the ease of doing business with the sustainability side of the corporate world.
Let's talk a bit about the Basel Institute then. What is it? Can you tell our listeners who may not be aware what the purposes and objectives are of the Institute?
Sure. So the Basel Institute is actually a foundation based out of Switzerland. And really, our core mission is to contribute to global efforts to prevent and combat corruption, but also to strengthen governance. So we've been around since 2003. We were established by Professor Mike Piat. Some of you may know him through his work and also as a professor, but also because he was the chair of the OECD Working Group on Bribery since the beginning of the working group and for 20 years. We've definitely been around for a while and have been known worldwide through our networks of partners as well on advancing more the topics around the evidence around anti-corruption, but also some of the practices and policies. We're also quite known because of our International Center on Asset Recovery, ICOR in short, that supports different facets of asset recovery around the world. And then also on the topic that are maybe more interesting for some of the listeners today on the topic of business integrity. We cover a lot of different facets, but I think that was also very much the intention at the inception of the Institute is that corruption is a very complex phenomenon and there is no silver bullet. And so you really need to go at it from different aspects. And so that's why we're very much looking at the prevention side, but then also the law enforcement piece through the asset recovery, the full-fledged response to combating corruption.
And certainly a holistic collective effort is needed for this big, wicked problem that we're all trying to get our heads around. I know the Institute was established in 2003, so we've got a good 20 years now of the Institute at work. And I'm always interested to see what have you learned during that period and how maybe have you changed your approach. So much has happened in the last 20 years when it comes to anti-corruption. Good work, where we see lots of governments, lots of private sector, lots of NGOs getting together to do good work. But what have you seen from your perspective, or what's the Institute seen as this has developed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so I think the early days of the Institute really coincided with the criminalization of corruption from the private sector perspective, right? And so I think that at the very beginning was also the beginning of the discussion around collective action. And I will talk about it a bit more later. But so that was really a big inception of the Institute. And then other topics started coming up. And so our International Center for Asset Recovery was founded and other discussions in terms of anti-money laundering started taking place. And you see also the emergence of all of these topics in different fora at the time. And so I think that also explains a little bit how the Institute has evolved because the topic started gaining a lot of traction in different spaces, both here in Switzerland as discussions. We were also involved in several discussions around collective action in the Wolfsburg group, for instance. It was just a little bit of a good timing to maybe expand a little bit the work in terms of not just the prevention piece, but also the enforcement part and look at it in that way. And actually, as a matter of fact, things have evolved so much that now we have also a whole program dedicated to green corruption. And that has also evolved, just trying to see some of the needs that are out there. So we're very much working with partners and we're working on the ground with practical solutions. And so that's why sometimes we also have to be a bit innovative and try to see where the more pressing needs are and try to evolve accordingly.
And it's so inspiring that you are looking for those opportunities for working together with various stakeholders. I personally believe this is critical. I think one of our other guests, Shruti Shah, worked for Transparency International, and then she now works for the Department of State in the US. A lot of the work she does is also trying to bring people together. And so I wanted to ask you, as I asked her, how is that working and how can people get involved to make sure that we're doing that effectively?
Yeah, so that's obviously a big part of the work that we do is bring people together. And you'd be surprised. Sometimes people are working in similar spaces and trying to solve similar issues, and they're not necessarily connected. Sometimes just because there aren't necessarily platforms that are already in place that allow that. We've seen, obviously, you were asking about the evolution as well. Over the last 20 years, a lot of these platforms now exist and allow for greater collaboration, be it from sector specific or different elements of policy making. There's definitely a lot more out there for people to be able to engage. So that's absolutely great. But there are also still other stakeholders that are left on the margins, are not necessarily contributing to that conversation. One of the things that we do focus on is, of course, collective action. And that's also about bringing different stakeholders together. And really, when you look at it, it's about bringing companies, but also other stakeholders together to tackle those shared problems of corruption that they have. And one of the key elements there is that alone, it's very difficult to solve these systemic issues that are either at a specific market level or a specific geography. But together, you can have a greater impact. But yeah, so that's what we do. But of course, all of this requires a lot of work to build trust.
Mhm.
And on paper, it sounds very easy, but it's definitely challenging. We've also seen that during times of COVID, it was also more challenging because we lost that element of being able to meet in person and build those long lasting connections. And yeah, so all of us in that space had to also adapt in that sense. The human touch is quite important when it comes to building trust and building those networks.
It really is. I'm glad you mentioned trust because that's really the pinnacle of the work we all do as compliance professionals is trust building. Trust building to get in the room and then trust building to be effective once you're in the room. So let's maybe double down that a bit. You said it's challenging. We all know it's challenging. Doing it remotely is more challenging. But what have you learned then that works when it comes to building trust with various different stakeholders? I know you work with governments, with other standard setters, with non-governmental organizations, the private sector. What's your secret sauce for building trust amongst these stakeholders?
Yeah, I think the position we're in, because we're a foundation and we're a think tank, so we're not on anyone's side as such,
Yeah.
and we work with the stakeholders. And I think that gives us a bit of an advantage because it's obviously easier to build trust when you're in that position. Where we see trust being more of a challenge is when you have like fundamental opposing agendas, right? So if you take some of our public sector stakeholders and some of the private sector stakeholders, you put them in a room, most often people will start pointing fingers, and that's a challenging starting point to have a conversation that will lead to building consensus. So I think for us, it's quite important to listen to all parties and really be in that listening mode, trying to understand what the fundamental issues are and what can be either a common denominator or trying to find like a first step into the right direction. I think that's also something to take into consideration is to really assess the willingness of each of the parties to actually collaborate, because sometimes it is a dead end, and we also have to
Mhm.
acknowledge when that's the case. But then when there is a small opening, then try to find those common denominators and work from there.
So powerful. You're so right to acknowledge the elephants in the room that people will come in with their biases and their experience of past history and their opportunity to blame, as you said. But if you can find some aligned goals, I think you said a common agenda. And I love the way you say it's even a small opening can have people looking to the future for the next right thing together. And one of my favorite phrases is to say, together we can do hard things well. But I love the way that you acknowledge that it's a hard thing and you have empathy for the various perspectives in the room but then look for that common alignment. It's wonderful, really important. So you are head of the private sector division at the Institute. So tell us a bit more about your role there and what you've been able to do in that from that perspective.
Sure. The reason why we're labeled the private sector is because we're dealing with everything that has to do with preventing corruption in the private sector. So that doesn't mean that we work just with the private sector. We also work with other stakeholders. But it's really the goal is that everything that we do is geared towards preventing corruption that pertains to the private sector. So we take a dual approach to that. The first one is really looking at technical assistance element of what we do. In other terms, is working directly with organizations to help them with their compliance programs. Sometimes it's starting them from scratch. Sometimes it's strengthening them. We do work with all types of stakeholders there. So we support SMEs, we support state-owned enterprises, multinationals, also international organizations. And the other component to that, which actually feeds into, they both feed into one another, is the collective action work. Because there we're looking at raising standards of integrity for a specific sector or specific market. We're looking at self regulatory standards and so on. So we have a foot in each side, and that allows us to be better informed when it comes to helping organizations establishing their own compliance programs. And at the same time, when we discuss this in the collective action format and through the different initiatives that we support, that also allows us to have a better understanding of some of the issues that are keeping compliance professionals up at night and some of the challenges and how these trends evolve. So that's really our dual approach to it that I think really works well in us becoming also better professionals and being better informed and keeping us on our toes a little bit as well.
I'm sure it does. Behemoth task that you set yourself to bring these various stakeholders in to do this complex work. But what I hear when you say collective action, I'm hearing crowdsourcing risk intelligence, doing benchmarking, making sure we all benefit from each other's experience. So that's really powerful work that we can do if we can get those perspectives in the room. I also want to say it feels like a movement, not a moment, right? It seems like collective action is a journey that you're getting on together and you're using everyone's perspectives to do that well. But let me not define it. Let me ask you, how do you define collective action? And then let's talk about some examples of what you've done.
Sure. It's, again, really bring businesses together and other stakeholders to solve corruption problems. And ultimately, the goal is to enhance fair competition, but also this idea of leveling the playing field. What we've discussed earlier of by bringing people together, then you can have change. But a company on its own will most likely not be able to succeed. And we've seen that happen in certain markets, but also in certain industries. So you have industry specific initiatives that allow to rate standards and allow to ensure that there are self-regulatory standards that are set in place or even just leveling the playing field in general. So that goes hand in hand. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years that was quite exciting for us working in that space is that it's taking up speed in terms of the normative element of collective action. It's made its way to certain national anti-corruption strategies.
Mhm.
It's made its way also into the 2021 OECD recommendation. And really now the expectation is that people need to engage in collective action, not just because it's nice to have, but because it's acknowledged as best practice and it's slowly becoming something you need to do, actually. So, yeah, I think it has its own benefits because you then also learn from others. You also gain information, but at the same time, it's just now something that it's regarded as just really something you need to be looking at quite carefully.
And it's a great example of an organic movement that then like you said, the normative rules follow and best practices are established by the industry themselves. And then the rules codify. Let's all continue to do this. I really like that. And actually, I want to pick up on something else you said about the self-regulatory standards that you're seeing these stakeholders come up with. We're often, as compliance professionals, tracking the norms. We're trying to implement the norms. But what I heard you say is that there's an element of self-regulation here. Can you talk more about that? Because I think that's really fascinating. And we'd all love to be in that proactive space where we come up with what's right and then the government and the laws follow. So talk to me more about what you've seen by way of self-regulatory standards.
Sure. There are a couple of examples there, but maybe one that comes to mind and that might be interesting is the work that we've done with Norges Bank Investment Management. So we were discussing with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund indicators of effectiveness of compliance programs. And we'd all love to have the silver bullet when it comes to being able to showcase that our compliance programs work. And we worked with companies in the pharma sector that were all contributing to that discussion. And through a collective action initiative, we were able to identify these indicators that were just a starting point for a broader conversation. Now, what was quite interesting is that these indicators have now been picked up by companies even beyond the pharma sector. And the idea that was that it would be aspirational in nature. So, of course, when we're looking at some of the extra financial reporting requirements, there are several that touch upon corruption, but a lot of them are not necessarily tailored to corruption as such. It's just usually your standard, how many people have you trained and how many times has your whistleblowing hotline been used and so on. So we were trying to be a bit more ambitious, always a bit of a challenge because again, we're looking at information that would be then in the public domain. I would say that again, it's work in progress, but it was quite interesting to see that the companies themselves had good practice that they were willing to share. And then we came up with this list of indicators. It's public information, so feel free to check it out. And then now companies are using them and disclosing what they are doing in terms of their efforts in anti-corruption. And for us, of course, it's not the only solution, but being also more transparent in terms of what you're doing in the anti-corruption space is also a good step in the right direction. And public disclosure has also its benefits, right? Of just holding corporations accountable to what they've published and what they said they've done. So I think it's one example. In terms of sector specific, there are great examples out there, and I'd really invite you to also check out the work of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. Definitely a great woman in compliance to talk to there. So their CEO is an ex-compliance officer who has set up this initiative, and they're really changing the narrative when it comes to corruption in the maritime space. They're, because of the critical size of their membership now, they do have a great representation in terms of the maritime trade, and they are able to collect information and data that is quite helpful also in the policymaking space. So, collecting evidence through anonymous reports in ports that can then also inform better decision making when it comes to the systems that are being put in place, some of the policy as well in different countries that are then identified as hotspots with hard evidence. So, really changing the narrative there. And it's not a legal requirement. So, companies can join a collective action initiative that's really voluntary. It's always voluntary. And so that's why I think a lot of great innovation comes out of it as well, because companies that join are willing to go the extra mile when it comes to doing the right thing and working on ethical and compliance matters.
It's so exciting to me because it makes me think we can think beyond our own companies, beyond our own functions, beyond even our own industries, and get together to solve bigger problems, right? So it might not, I can see myself thinking, oh, corruption happens, what can you do? But the people that you're describing, your work makes me realize that there are people out there saying, we're going to find out what we can do, and we're going to do it together, and we're going to do it at scale, and we're going to help other people to do it too. Really excited to hear this work is happening, really inspired by the work that you said, for example, the collective action initiative, where you have the indicators of an effective anti-corruption program. This is a really interesting one for me. I hope it will be for my listeners, because many of us are focused just on the government guidelines. At least in the United States, we refer constantly to the DOJ Effective Compliance Program guidelines, the SEC's work, the enforcement cases. But we come to a barrier that sometimes they don't feel practical for our actual lived experience. There's friction because our businesses say, it doesn't necessarily make sense for us. Where did that come from? And we're saying, the government said. What I like about what you've described is that you've got indicators of an effective anti-corruption program that go beyond what the government may have said and actually what the industry themselves have thought about could be effective. And specifically, I think you mentioned that the typical ways we measure the effectiveness may not be the right ones.
Beyond being right or wrong, right? It's saying we all know the guidance, we've all read it, we're all subject to similar laws and regulations. So, what do we foresee as being best practice? And I think having a conversation around that and how do you implement it? And I think that's where it becomes really interesting, because then you can have a peer exchange in terms of saying, this is how we've rolled it out in our company. And these are also some of the struggles. I think we also have to acknowledge that. And again, the list of indicators is a great example of that. If you read the document, you see the list of indicators. But it was a lot of back and forth between the companies just saying, actually, I don't agree. We don't do it that way. And these are some of the challenges. And these are some of the reasons why it's a challenge for us, and so on. The list, in the end, we also just decided with a group of companies to say, this is a list that is aspirational in nature. It is not a requirement. But we collectively acknowledge that it would be great to have all of this information. And it's about the process of getting there. So, first year, not sure everyone's going to publish on it. But then as time goes by, then hopefully compliance officers also have the leverage in house to say, actually, it would be really interesting to be able to collect that information and try to make sure that we're in a position where we can collect the data and build a narrative around it and be able to go public with it.
I 100% agree. And I think we will absolutely share the resource with the show notes for this episode. I encourage everyone to go look at the indicators of an effective anti-corruption program. I know you said it's for the healthcare sector, but it actually has lessons for all industries. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the intention was to start with the healthcare industry, but they're not healthcare specific.
And the same, you mentioned the CEO of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. I absolutely want to invite her as a guest to learn more about that. But again, another place where we can go and find information. We'll make sure we provide that resource. So we've talked a little bit about leveraging the private sector to, of their own initiative, get together and set the standards that are practical and applicable and then share those. I am also mindful of the number of standard setters and the number of regulations that any one global multinational company has to deal with. So my next question really goes to, how do you work with other standard setters whether it's the OECD or if it's the ISO standards for anti-corruption or governments themselves as they build their legislation? How do you interact with those bodies in order to make sure that we're taking your perspectives into account?
So we're often consulted by them. I would say we don't necessarily always have a formal way of engaging, but if there are broader public consultations where we're part of that discussion and we're being asked to provide information, I think also another part that we're consulted on by countries is because of our track record working with other jurisdictions and helping them out, for instance, in developing anti-corruption strategies and so on. And because we have different parts of the house at the Basel Institute, that also allows us to connect the dots. So that's how we engage. There are also different events and fora throughout the year focusing more on policymaking. And that's also a place where we're at. I think that's maybe also for me, invitation to companies that are not necessarily part of those conversations. Those conversations are taking place. And more often than not, the private sector is being consulted. And yeah, and I think it's quite important that the private sector also has a seat at the table and can discuss different areas that they see as new challenges or potential areas of innovation. And I would say that's often what we get asked about by governments is how do we reach out to the private sector?
Mm.
We're talking about people working together. I think there are still very natural silos, and policymakers are not necessarily do not come from the private sector and therefore don't necessarily have the right networks there. So sometimes it's as simple as that, as connecting people or at least connecting them, telling them where to find information as a starting point. There's a lot of work also that goes through some of the business associations, chambers of commerce that are also good avenues to disseminate information to a broader audience when it comes to the private sector. But yeah, so that's how we engage with them as well.
Very nice. And then where could our guests find more information about how to engage with you, whether it's through business associations, as you said, or lobbying groups or directly? How can we get involved?
So we do have a dedicated website to collective action, so called the B20 Collective Action Hub. That is a repository of information when it comes to all things collective action.
Yeah.
It also includes a database of more than 300 initiatives worldwide. So that's also a great starting point when you're looking at inspiration, looking at connecting with others, either in your sector or within the same region or country. And yeah, and so I think we try to make it as useful as possible. There's also a help desk there. But of course, you can also feel free to reach out directly. I think we're always open to discuss and also entertain new ideas. I think also another element is that we do organize roundtable discussions. We also organize events throughout the year. Last June, we hosted our fifth International Collective Action Conference that brought together different stakeholders from all over the world. We had about 200 people that came together here in Basel. So that's also something that we organize every other year. So different ways to connect, I think. And also sometimes people just reach out because they don't know where to start. And we're definitely always happy to assist with that.
It sounds like you're building a wonderful global community that is interested in these, again, aligned goals, ways that they can move forward together. And I know you mentioned earlier that what part of your dual approach is technical assistance. Are there services that you provide to the private sector on demand?
Yeah, we do. But sometimes, most of the time, it's more to groups of companies.
Okay.
Now, in the past, we've also worked with organizations directly when they did ask for assistance on a specific compliance issue that they wanted to solve. So that's also something that we do. And we have colleagues who are dedicated to that and do work all over the world to help organizations. I think maybe one common denominator there is that there is then also access to that broader platform and that peer learning element. So most of the time, the organizations that we work with are definitely open to engage with others and learn from others because, again, we work around the world, right? So we're also looking at global best practices in that sense. Yeah. So that's also another way to engage.
So many exciting things that you're doing. I'm so grateful to you for your work, Vanessa. I'd hate to close this up, but I wanted to ask you one last question before we do. Have you got any parting thoughts for our Great Women in Compliance listeners when it comes to their role, when it comes to global anti-corruption?
I think it's really about trying to break those silos. I know we're all busy in our day-to-day work, but there is definitely power in sharing more information and sharing knowledge. And so I think, yeah, going the extra mile when it comes to contributing to these communities of practice is extremely helpful. we always have something to learn. So I think that's also something to keep in mind is no matter what size of organization or whether sector is, there's always something to learn from others. So I would really encourage people to reach out and try to engage as much as possible and learn from each other.
So important. You say going the extra mile. This brings us full circle to your hobby or your second career as an endurance cyclist, right? Like you've clearly gone the extra mile when it comes to your cycling and when it comes to your global anti-corruption career. So thank you for being such an inspiring great woman in compliance. And it's an endurance sport. Global anti-corruption work is an endurance sport, just like your cycling.
Absolutely.
But as you said so beautifully, there are many miles to cover in many places and many people to meet along the way. So I'm so grateful that our paths crossed as part of your endurance sports. And we're very grateful to you for sharing your insights and your experiences with the Great Women in Compliance community. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Emma. It was a pleasure.